All right. Thanks for listening to this podcast. This podcast is Convincing Proof, and my name is Adam Johnson. I'm excited to do this because it gives me the opportunity in a shorter amount of time just to share with you some of the things that I've learned and that have been beneficial to me, and I hope they can be useful to others. So, in the last couple episodes, I've been talking about the relationship between faith and reason. And last time I went through and explained how I think a good case can be made from Scripture that the correct relationship between faith and reason is that they work together. So I believe that the Bible teaches that we should trust in Jesus Christ based on good reasons and evidence. And we went through several sections of Scripture that I think indicate that. So I believe, and I try to make the case, that the biblical understanding of faith and reason is that they work together. They're not enemies. They're not opposites. And in fact, God instructs us to trust Him based on good reasons and evidence. Now, as I've been saying in the last couple episodes, we are in a unique time in history where people don't think of faith and reason that way. People, both inside and outside the church, tend to think of faith and reason as enemies, as opposites, actually. And so people have this mindset where, look, there's certain things that we know through reason. Maybe science, scientific facts, other things that we can use our reason to know. Evidence, reason, we know these set of things, these set of facts. And then there's other things that we just have to take on faith. There's no evidence, there's no proof, there's no reason to believe it. You just gotta believe on faith. And it's kind of like there's two sets of truths or two sets of beliefs. Beliefs you can establish by reason and evidence, and then beliefs you just have to take on faith. And they think then, even within the church, often that faith and reason are enemies. And I want to kind of walk through how this came about. Where did these ideas come from? Because they don't seem to be found in Scripture. So let me just walk back through history and try to explain, where these, as I would say, incorrect ideas came from about the relationship between faith and reason. And to do this, I'm going to be very brief. If you want to take my entire philosophy class that I've taught at seminaries in Germany and here in America, I've recorded all those lectures, and you can watch them, listen to them for free on my website, convincingproof.org. But in just hopefully 10, maybe 15 minutes here, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the entire class. So I'm going to overgeneralize, but I'm going to try to walk through Western history and show where this idea of faith and reason being enemies came from. I'm going to do this just to make it simple by talking about three eras. And this is fairly common. You'll hear a lot of people break down Western philosophy or Western thinking or Western culture in these three eras. And the terms that I'm referring to are the pre-modern era, the modern era, and the postmodern era. Now, what makes these three eras unique is that people thought very differently within these eras. There are different ways of thinking, if you will. So you can think of the pre-modern era, maybe, from 0 to the 1500s, roughly. And then the modern era might be, starting possibly in the 1500s, definitely 1700s, a little bit in the 1800s. But then the postmodern era begins in the 1800s and continues through today. And these are just very rough timelines. These are just very, as historians try to do, they put things in categories, philosophers. So that's what I'm doing here. Well, in the pre-modern era, the pre-modern way of thinking was similar to what I explained that the Bible teaches, that faith and reason work together. We should base our beliefs, even our religious beliefs, if you want to call them that, based on good reasons and evidence. But I'm going to fast forward through that pre-modern era. I mean, some of the major thinkers you can think of during that era would be like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Anselm. So those are probably the big names, the big thinkers in the pre-modern era. But things change once you get to the modern era. So let's talk about the modern era a little bit. So in the modern era, we experienced a lot of success with our human reason, right? You can think of the scientific revolution. You can think about the Enlightenment of the 1700s. And it was during that period, we, as human beings, just achieved a lot with our human reason. Technology, medicine, scientific discoveries. It was a very neat and exciting time in our history. And all those successes led to a lot of optimism about our ability to reason and figure things out as human beings. We got very optimistic about what we could solve, what we could figure out using our human reason, because of all the successes that we experienced. But we probably became, and I say we, just Western culture, we became a bit too optimistic. In fact, it turned towards the end, for sure, into more of a pride, a mistaken pride, a mistaken optimism about what we could figure out in or using our human reason. I mean, there were some thinkers who thought, look, we're about ready to solve all human problems, all diseases, the aging process. I mean, it's hard to communicate how much optimism there was based on our human reason, that we were going to figure everything out and solve all of our human problems with our reason. And it's in that era, in that modern era, where faith and reason first started to be broken apart, to be started to look at as opposites or enemies. So as you can imagine, then, in the modern era, reason was king. Reason was the cat's meow. Reason was was elevated, and faith was looked down upon. Okay. So you've got Descartes, for instance, the father of modern philosophy, and even though he didn't disparage faith, he said he came along and he said, look, I can establish the truths of our religion, Christianity, using just reason alone. And he tried to, and he, as a mathematician, the Cartesian coordinates, x, y axis, right? He's the father of that as well. He said, I can prove, that God exists, that humans have a soul. I can prove the beliefs of our Christian religion using reason alone, similar to how I can prove my mathematical proofs using reason alone. And so if you read Descartes, that's what he sets out to do. He says, look, you can believe these things on faith as well. I'm not disparaging that, but I'm providing you a way just purely on reason alone. Another example in this modern era, and this person, Voltaire, at least the early Voltaire, he does disparage faith and elevate reason. Listen to this quote from Voltaire. He wrote, "What is faith? Is it to believe that which is evident? No, it's perfectly evident to my mind that there exists a necessary, eternal, supreme, and intelligent being. This is no matter of faith, but of reason." And so here in the modern era, faith and reason became enemies. And reason was elevated, and faith was looked down upon. Now, I'm not going to be able to go through all the details of how the optimism within modernism fell apart. Modernism ran into a whole host of problems. Maybe I'll just share one. So one example of how modernism fell apart, it just ran into a whole host of problems. One of the primary ones was their understanding of love. right? For centuries, thousands of years, humans have thought of love as a very special thing, that was part and parcel of our humanity, was our love for one another, whether it was romantic love or love for friendships or our children. But what happened in modernism is, as it developed, it established more of a mechanical understanding of things. So you can think of even Isaac Newton's laws of motion. But the modern way of thinking developed into this view of the world, the universe, as just this vast machine, that everything was determined by, for example, the laws of motion, deterministic laws, cause and effect, that everything functioned in the universe, in reality, as a well-ordered machine. But consider what that would do to human beings then. And at first, in the modern era, people didn't think of humans as being caught up in the machine, caught up in the chain of cause and effect. But eventually, they couldn't avoid it. They said, no, we're just part of the machine. We're part of this mechanics, this cause and effect. We're stuck in that chain. We are machines ourselves. We're just robots. So here's a quote from Jacques Monod, a French thinker, Nobel Prize winner, one of the founders of molecular biology. But his quote, I think this quote I'm going to read to you, really captures the conclusion that modernism came to when it in terms of human beings and love. So Jacques Monod, he wrote, "Anything can be reduced to simple, obvious mechanical interactions. The cell is a machine. The animal is a machine. Man is a machine. The universe isn't pregnant with life, nor the biosphere with man. Man at last knows that he's alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which he emerged only by chance. His destiny is nowhere spelled out, nor is his duty." End quote. So if you think about that, what would that, that sort of understanding of humanity do to your view of love? According to modernism, then love is just a chemical reaction. It's just, eventually, when we get into the 1800s, the conclusion was that love, this chemical reaction we experience, romantic love, friendship love, love for our children, is just an accidental mistake, a random accident that happened in our ancient past that nature selected for because it led to greater chances of survival and reproduction. So romantic love, right? You fall in love and want to have sex, want to have children, because that's just what evolution programmed you to do. It's not real, it's not special, it's just, our evolutionary programming, basically. Same thing, why we love our children, why we love friendship, those are all just happenstance chemical reactions that occurred millions of years ago, and nature selected for it because it led to greater chances of survival and reproduction, as you can imagine. Anyway, that's the theory, and that's the modern take on love. But you can see what that does to your thinking then about your relationships with other people. And it's like, well, I guess they're not real. I guess it's just part of my programming as a machine to, to be sexually attracted to people, to love my friends and my spouse and my children. None of that's real. It's just an accident of evolution. So it's just one example of how modernism came to some very negative, almost crushing conclusions. And it caused a lot of Western culture to slip into an existential crisis. I mean, if we're just programmed machines, then, what really is humanity? Are we anything special? What do we even exist? Are we just programmed robots walking around, playing the program in our genes that was not programmed by a programmer, but just by an accidental process of evolution, meaningless. So you can see how that would be crushing. Well, out of all of this failure of modernism, these crushing blows, these existential crises, I just gave you one example, that came out of modernism, that's from which postmodernism was born. Because a lot of people just did not want to accept those conclusions, those blunt, crushing conclusions of modernism. And so the way that I understand postmodernism is that postmodernism is a series of movements in the 1800s and the 1900s that was responding against modernism, responding against the elevation of reason, responding against the mechanical view of things. And so the first postmodern movement was Romanticism. Now, when we think of Romanticism, we usually think of paintings and literature in the early 1800s, but Romanticism was much more than just paintings and literature. That was part of it, but it was a whole movement of philosophical thought that a lot of art came along with it, of course, as art usually does follow philosophy. But it was a reaction, the first reaction against modernism, the movement called Romanticism in the early 1800s. So Romanticism, for example, challenged the idea that reason and science was the ultimate form of knowledge. Romanticism challenged the mechanical view of the world, that the world could best be understood through deterministic laws of nature. Instead, Romanticism emphasized the inner life, our feelings, emotions, desires, choices, will, and through that, celebrated love. So they, were reacting against modernism's conclusion on love, and instead of just dismissing it as just a random accident of nature, said, no, love is real. We don't understand it or what it is. It's this unreasonable force. You just fall in love. It's like this power, this force that comes over you from the inside. It can't be explained. It can't be understood with reason. It's an irrational thing, but we just believe in love so powerfully because it moves us, even though we don't have any rational explanation of why we should think that way. So love, for example, they said, shouldn't be known via reason. There's no reasons and evidence to think that love is real, but we're going to believe in it anyway. We're going to take an irrational leap of faith. And I find this to be, you can see this sort of understanding. I mean, even though we're talking about Romanticism in the early 1800s, and so many of our modern day movies, this idea still continues. And I could use examples from all sorts of Marvel movies, Star Wars movies. But the one that I like to use the most is Interstellar, Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. There is a scene right in the middle of the movie between Matthew McConaughey and Anne Hathaway, where Matthew McConaughey represents the modern view of love, right? That it's just evolution, it's just our programming. But then Anne Hathaway makes this plea that no, we need to follow our heart, and love is real even if we don't understand it. And you can watch the movie, it's right in the middle. They're trying to determine what planet to go to. But Christopher Nolan uses that 5 minutes in the movie to express these two huge movements in our culture, modernism and postmodernism. Now, I appreciate Romanticism in the sense that I appreciate its critique of modernism, but I think Romanticism and all the other postmodern movements that came along after it didn't provide the right solution. They might have provided some good, correct critiques of modernism, but instead of going back to pre-modernism, which is what I would propose, they came up with some new ideas, which might be just as bad as the modern way of thinking, if not worse, actually. Okay, well, there's a whole fascinating story, and it's hard for me to make this succinct, but there's a whole fascinating set of stories about how modernism ran into problems and postmodern ideas then were born out of that, out of those problems. But let's just focus on faith and reason here. So, one of the things that happened during the modern era was that some thinkers in the modern era began to try to use reason and evidence and science. Science is just an application of our human reason, right? But some modern thinkers tried to use reason, evidence, science to disprove Christianity. And this caused, some Christians real concern. And one of the strategies that some denominations, some churches, some Christian leaders took is we're going to basically retreat from reason and science. They thought that they could protect their Christian faith by separating it from reason. So in other words, they kept faith and reason as enemies, but they prized faith and looked down on reason. So I use the example of, you know how when little kids come over to your house, you put all your delicate, valuable stuff on an upper shelf so they can't reach it and break it. So these Christians in the 1800s kind of took this strategy. They said, look, we're going to put our faith up on the upper shelf so it can't be reached by reason, science, evidence. Our faith is separate from those things. So it can't be disproven by reason and evidence and science because it's on this upper shelf where reason, science, evidence can't touch it, so to speak. So they thought they were protecting their faith, if you will. And you can see this sort of thinking in Kierkegaard, even Immanuel Kant, kind of a precursor to this idea, but those ideas are definitely in his writings. This idea that faith and reason are separate, and faith isn't based on reason and evidence. Faith is more based on, our intuition, our feelings, our desires. It's kind of like how the Romantics believed in love. We don't have a reason or explanation for it. We're just going to take a leap of faith and we're going to believe in love. No matter what reason and evidence says, no matter how much scientific reason and evidence you have for evolution and that love was just programming in our evolutionary path, we're going to reject all that reason and evidence and just believe in love. Take this leap of faith and just believe in love. And some Christians, took that same strategy with their faith. We don't care what reason, science, evidence says. We're just going to believe in Christianity, believe in Christ. And reason and evidence can't touch our belief because reason and faith are separate types of beliefs. And so I understand the strategy that they were doing, but I think it was just a horrendous mistake. Because while, yes, maybe in their minds this protected their faith from being disproven by reason and evidence, it also cut them off from considering reasons and evidence for their faith. And so it churned Christian faith into more of this subjective, irrational choice based on desires and feelings. And they spiritualized it, of course. They tried to make it sound all spiritual and romantic. And it's this inner movement. It's this, God will just speak to your heart, and then you'll just know inside. And all this spiritual talk to romanticize it. But the bottom line was they separated faith, or they separated faith from reason, elevated faith, and looked down upon reason. I'll give you a quote here from Kierkegaard, which summarizes this idea really well. So Kierkegaard wrote, "To have faith is to lose your mind and to win God. The fact that Christianity is contrary to reason is the necessary precondition for true faith. What I really lack is to be clear in my mind what I am to do, not what I am to know. The thing is to find a truth that is true for me, to find the ideas for which I can live and die." And for Kierkegaard, of course, that was Christianity. So you can even see in that a lot of relativism, this idea of, well, you've got your truth, I've got my truth. And part of the blame for that relative truth way of thinking in our culture today goes back to these Christians who tried to protect their faith, but by doing so separated faith and reason. So Kierkegaard, Kant, and others, they kept the modern dichotomy between faith and reason, but flip-flopped it. Whereas modernism elevated reason, now in the postmodern era, Christians and others were elevating faith. But when I say faith, because a lot of times people hear me say that, and they're like, Well, how could faith ever be a bad thing, right? How could faith ever be wrong? But if you think about it, when you separate faith from reason, it completely transforms what faith is. And it's that sort of blind, irrational leap of faith where your beliefs are just based on your desires and your feelings instead of based on good reasons and evidence. That's the type of faith that I'm saying here is mistaken and incorrect. I don't think that's what the Bible teaches, and I think it's just incorrect. It's a mistake to view faith and reason that way. I think our faith, like all of our beliefs, should be based on good reasons and evidence. If you think about it, this isn't unique to religion either. And this is part of just being in our postmodern culture that we're in the last 200 years. So you've got, folks today who think that gender should be based on how you feel on the inside as well. So not only should your religious faith be based on how you feel on the inside, you take an irrational leap of faith to believe in your religion, whatever works for you, whatever makes you feel good, whatever. You just take that leap of faith. Same thing with your gender. It's how you feel on the inside. And so the strategy has been used across our culture when it comes to all sorts of things. Because the postmodern mantra is you believe truth comes from inside of you. Truth is found in your heart. And this is just where I have huge problems with postmodernism and the Christian extension or the Christian adoption of postmodernism, this leap of faith mentality where you see faith and reason as enemies. It turns Christianity into an emotional, subjective thing. Now, of course, I always have to qualify here because we don't want to elevate reason too high either, right? That was the mistake of modernism, this prideful reason where we think we can figure out everything on our own. But we also don't want this other postmodern extreme. So you can think of extreme modernism on one side and then extreme postmodernism on the other side. The mistake that both ends are making, both ends of the continuum are making the same mistake though. They're viewing faith and reason as opposites or enemies. One of them is just elevating reason and the other side of the continuum is elevating faith too much. But I'm advocating for more of what I would call biblical and definitely the pre-modern understanding of faith and reason, that faith and reason work together. As I've described in previous podcasts, where all of our beliefs should be based on good reasons and evidence. We can never know anything with absolute certainty, I would contend, because we're finite, we're not omniscient like God, right? So all of our beliefs have some element of uncertainty in them, whether they're scientific beliefs, religious beliefs, however you want to categorize different beliefs. I just say beliefs about reality. I have certain beliefs about reality. I'm not 100% certain of any of them because I know I'm finite. I'm not omniscient like God. And so but I base my beliefs, faith, trust, beliefs, whatever you want to call them, based on good reasons and evidence. So whether I'm choosing a mechanic, choosing a spouse, choosing who to believe in religious matters, choosing what to believe in religious matters, I'm basing all of those beliefs based on good reasons and evidence, or I try to as much as I can, knowing that I'll never get to absolute certainty, so there's always going to be an element of faith or trust in all my beliefs. But faith and reason work together. That's the key thing that I'm trying to get across, that our beliefs, any beliefs that we have, should be based on good reasons and evidence.